The city of Ravensheim had always been a place of constant motion, bustling streets, neon-lit billboards flashing advertisements, and late-night eateries serving tired office workers. But beneath the hum of everyday life, something sinister lurked, unnoticed by the millions who called this city home. Dr. Evelyn Carter adjusted her glasses as she stared at the medical reports piling up on her desk. Patients were showing up in emergency rooms with strange symptoms, memory loss, confusion, and a disturbing tendency to wander aimlessly before collapsing into unconsciousness. What baffled her was the rapid spread of these cases across different districts, with no clear link between the victims. Meanwhile, journalist Mark Sullivan was piecing together his own puzzle. Reports of missing people were skyrocketing, and security footage from a subway station captured something deeply unsettling. A man collapsed on the platform, convulsing violently. Moments later, he stood up, his eyes vacant. He lunged at a woman nearby, biting into her shoulder as panicked commuters fled. Mark knew a story when he saw one, and this wasn't just another crime spree. This was something bigger. Elsewhere in the city, a homeless man named Henry staggered through an alley, clutching his stomach in pain. His skin was pale, his breath shallow. He had been feeling sick for days, but tonight, something was different. His limbs twitched uncontrollably. His vision blurred. Then, as if possessed by an unseen force, he fell to the ground in violent spasms. Moments later, he stopped moving. The alley was silent. Then, he opened his eyes. The infection had taken root. Across Ravensheim, similar incidents were unfolding, people collapsing in the middle of the street, in restaurants, in shopping malls. Some recovered, unaware of what had happened. Others didn't get back up at all. But the real horror began when those who had fallen started to rise again, with hunger in their eyes. By the time the city realized something was wrong, it was already too late. The silent invasion had begun. The morning news barely covered the incidents from the previous night. A few vague reports of violent assaults and unexplained medical cases aired between weather updates and stock market reports. To the average citizen, it was just another day in Ravensheim. But for those who had seen the horrors firsthand, the city felt different. Dr. Evelyn Carter rushed through the hospital halls, dodging panicked nurses and frantic doctors. The ER was packed. More patients had arrived overnight, many with the same symptoms. Some sat motionless, their eyes glazed over, unresponsive to any stimuli. Others were restrained to their beds, growling and thrashing violently, biting at anyone who came too close. Evelyn's fingers trembled as she flipped through the latest lab results. Something was infecting these people at an alarming rate. Their blood work showed aggressive cellular decay, like their bodies were breaking down from the inside. But what disturbed her the most was the regeneration. Dead tissue shouldn't be reanimating. Something was deeply, terribly wrong. Panic on the streets. Journalist Mark Sullivan was already on the move, camera in hand. He had barely slept after reviewing the subway attack footage. There was no denying it, this wasn't a normal act of violence. The attacker had been a man who collapsed moments earlier, only to rise and attack someone without any logical reason. His editor refused to air the footage, calling it sensationalist garbage. But Mark knew what he saw. Determined to find more evidence, he headed to the subway station where the attack had occurred. As he neared, he noticed something strange. The station was closed, police tape blocking the entrance. Uniformed officers stood guard, refusing to let anyone in. "Hey, what's going on here?" Mark asked, flashing his press badge. One of the officers shot him a tired look. "Nothing you need to worry about. There was an accident. Station's closed until further notice." "An accident?" Mark scoffed. "You mean the guy who dropped dead and then attacked a woman?" The officer stiffened. "I said, move along." Mark clenched his jaw. They were hiding something. Citywide unrest. Meanwhile, social media was exploding with unverified footage, clips of people collapsing in malls, of security guards struggling to restrain wild-eyed, foaming-mouthed attackers. Some videos showed people walking normally before suddenly seizing up and collapsing, only to rise moments later and lash out at those around them. At first, people laughed, calling it staged horror content. But soon, the reports became impossible to ignore. By noon, emergency hotlines were overwhelmed. People were begging for ambulances, reporting family members acting aggressively, neighbors attacking each other, even entire office floors descending into chaos. The mayor held a press conference, urging citizens to remain calm. He dismissed the reports as isolated incidents, suggesting a new designer drug might be responsible for the erratic behavior. "The situation is under control," he assured. But the truth was, it wasn't. Quarantine begins. At Ravensshire General Hospital, Evelyn was running out of time. More patients were arriving by the minute. Some were already dead before reaching the ER. Others were brought in by terrified family members, only to suddenly turn violent once inside. Then, the first fatal attack happened. A young nurse, barely in her 20s, was treating a restrained patient when the man lunged forward, biting deep into her throat. Blood sprayed across the white hospital walls as she collapsed, screaming. Other nurses rushed in, trying to restrain the attacker, but he fought with inhuman strength, breaking free from his restraints. Security was called, but the chaos spread faster than they could contain it. Other patients began convulsing and seizing before rising with the same empty, hunger-filled eyes. Within minutes, the hospital became a war zone. Evelyn barely escaped to her office, locking the door behind her as screams filled the halls. She grabbed her phone with shaking hands and dialed the only number she could think of. "Mark." He answered on the first ring. "Evelyn? You need to get out of the city," she gasped, pressing her back against the door as the sound of bodies thudding against it grew louder. "Now." The city falls. Elsewhere in Ravensshire, the infection was spreading like wildfire. Police stations were flooded with calls, officers stretched too thin to respond to every report. Then, the real collapse began. The infected no longer just lashed out randomly. They started moving in groups, hunting together. First, they overran small neighborhoods. Then, entire streets. People ran in all directions, searching for safety, only to find more death at every turn. By nightfall, the mayor issued a citywide curfew. The National Guard was called in. Roads were blocked, but it was too late. The infection had spread beyond containment. The silent invasion had turned into a full-blown nightmare. The city of Ravensshire had become a battleground overnight. Sirens blared, gunfire echoed through the streets, and thick smoke rose into the sky as buildings burned. The once thriving metropolis had turned into a nightmare. Evelyn sat in the back of an abandoned ambulance, clutching a bloody lab report. Her hands trembled as she tried to process everything. The infection wasn't just spreading, it was evolving. The bodies she had examined showed signs of rapid adaptation, as if the pathogen inside them was learning, growing stronger. Mark sat across from her, wiping blood off his camera lens. "We need to get out of here," he muttered, eyes darting to the distant figures staggering through the foggy streets. But escape wasn't that simple. Lockdown and chaos. The military had arrived in full force, setting up barricades and checkpoints across the city. Helicopters roared overhead, shining searchlights down on the streets, hunting for survivors. But instead of rescuing people, they were containing them. No one was allowed to leave. Soldiers in hazmat suits dragged screaming civilians out of their homes, shoving them into transport trucks. Official announcements blared from speakers on street corners. "For your safety, remain indoors. Do not engage with the infected. The situation is under control." It was a lie. Gunfire rang out near a barricade, followed by agonized screams. Mark and Evelyn crouched behind a toppled street sign, peeking at the scene. A group of desperate survivors had rushed a checkpoint, hoping to escape. The soldiers opened fire without hesitation. "They're not saving anyone," Evelyn whispered in horror. "They're covering this up," Mark muttered, gripping his camera. They knew this was coming. No safe haven. the infection spread faster than the military could contain it. Even fortified zones fell one by one. Soldiers turned into the very monsters they were fighting, forced to shoot their own comrades. Mark and Evelyn moved cautiously through the wreckage of the city, searching for supplies. Every corner held fresh horrors, bodies torn apart, people banging on locked doors, begging for help. They stumbled upon a supermarket where a group of survivors had barricaded themselves inside. At first, Mark thought they had found safety. But when they got closer, they realized the truth. The people inside weren't hiding. They were eating. Evelyn clapped a hand over her mouth as she saw them, once normal citizens, now tearing into raw meat, their fingers slick with blood. Some of them weren't fully turned yet. Their eyes flickered with recognition, as if they were still aware of what they were doing, but unable to stop. One of them turned, sniffing the air. Mark grabbed Evelyn's wrist. "Run." Betrayal in the dark. They sprinted through the streets, ducking into an abandoned apartment complex. They weren't alone. A group of armed survivors had set up camp in the upper floors. Their leader, a grizzled ex-cop named Daryl, eyed Mark's camera with suspicion. "You're the reporter, right?" Daryl asked. "The one trying to expose the truth?" Mark hesitated. "Yeah." Daryl sneered. "Truth don't matter anymore. It's about who survives." Evelyn could feel the tension in the air. These people weren't just scared, they were desperate. And desperation made people dangerous. As night fell, Mark checked his footage, whispering to Evelyn. "There's something bigger going on. The military isn't here to stop this, they're here to clean up their mess." Before Evelyn could respond, there was a loud bang. Gunshots. The survivors were fighting among themselves. Someone had tried to steal supplies. Accusations flew, followed by more gunfire. It wasn't just the infected they had to fear. Mark and Evelyn took the chance to slip away. But as they made their way down the fire escape, they heard the sounds of heavy boots marching below. More soldiers. More gunfire. The military wasn't rescuing survivors anymore. They were eliminating them. Nowhere left to run. Evelyn's mind raced. The city was locked down. The infection was spreading. The military was covering it up. And they were trapped in the middle of it all. "We need a new plan," Mark whispered. Evelyn nodded, glancing at the skyline, where helicopters patrolled the ruins of Ravensheim. "We're not getting out of here alive, unless we find out what they're hiding." The silent invasion was no longer silent. It was war. The streets of Ravensheim were unrecognizable. The once bustling city had been reduced to smoldering ruins, the air thick with the acrid stench of burning flesh. The infected roamed freely now, their groans echoing between the hollowed-out buildings. The few remaining survivors scurried like rats, hiding in the shadows, scavenging for anything that could keep them alive. Evelyn and Mark kept low as they moved through the wreckage of an overturned bus, avoiding the shambling figures just meters away. The infected had started to change. They weren't just wandering aimlessly anymore, they were moving in packs, hunting. "We need to get off the streets," Mark whispered. Evelyn nodded. "We won't last another night out here." But finding shelter was easier said than done. A dangerous alliance. As they turned a corner, they ran straight into trouble, a group of survivors, heavily armed, standing behind makeshift barricades of burned-out cars and barbed wire. "Hold it right there," a voice barked. Mark and Evelyn froze. A burly man stepped forward, his rifle aimed at them. His face was covered in grime, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. "You bit?" he demanded. "No," Evelyn said quickly, raising her hands. "We're clean." The man studied them for a long moment, then lowered his weapon. "You want to live? You follow our rules." The survivors led them into an abandoned warehouse, one of the few strongholds still standing. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of sweat and desperation. Families huddled together in corners, their faces gaunt with hunger. Mark scanned the group. These weren't just civilians, there were ex-cops, former gang members, and even a few soldiers who had gone rogue. It wasn't a community. It was a war camp. Survival at a cost. The leader, a scarred woman named Quinn, wasted no time explaining the rules. "You want food, you earn it," she said, tossing Mark a rifle. "We take shifts securing the perimeter. Anyone who doesn't pull their weight gets thrown out." Evelyn swallowed hard. Thrown out? Into that? She gestured toward the moaning horde outside. Quinn's expression remained cold. "Better them than us." Mark clenched his jaw, but he knew they had no choice. If they wanted to survive, they had to play along. The evolution of the infected. That night, while the others rested, Evelyn studied her notes under the dim glow of a flashlight. She had been tracking the infection's progression, and what she found chilled her to the bone. "They're changing," she whispered to Mark. "At first, they were slow. Mindless. But now..." Mark had seen it too. Earlier that day, he had watched in horror as a group of infected moved together, herding a survivor into a dead end before tearing him apart. "They're learning," he said grimly. Evelyn's fingers tightened around the page of her notebook. "We're running out of time." The plan to escape. The warehouse wasn't safe. Not really. Supplies were running low, and tensions were rising. People whispered in the dark about those who had been removed by Quinn's enforcers. Mark and Evelyn needed to get out before they became expendable. That's when they overheard something that changed everything. Late that night, as Mark stood watch near the entrance, he heard Quinn and her second-in-command whispering. "The military's pulling out in 48 hours, Quinn said. "They're gonna bomb the whole city." Mark's heart pounded. "They want to wipe this place off the map," Quinn continued. "No one gets out alive." Mark backed away slowly, his mind racing. He had to tell Evelyn. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were racing against time. The city wasn't just dying. It was about to be erased. The truth hit Evelyn and Mark like a sledgehammer. Raven's Hire wasn't just overrun. It was scheduled for extermination. The military had given up on containment. Instead, they were going to erase the city from existence. 48 hours. That's all the time they had left. Evelyn's mind raced with possibilities. "There has to be a way out," she whispered. Mark glanced around the warehouse, where desperate survivors huddled together, oblivious to the doom looming over them. "We can't stay here. And we can't tell them. If they panic, Quinn will kill us before the bombs do." Evelyn clenched her fists. They needed a plan. Fast. An unlikely escape route. They snuck out of the warehouse under the cover of darkness, moving swiftly through the ruined streets. The city's infrastructure was collapsing, fires burned unchecked, the stench of death filled the air, and the infected were everywhere. "We need a route past the military checkpoints," Mark said, scanning his map. "If they're pulling out, they'll have an evacuation route for their own people. We just need to find it." Evelyn nodded. "Or make our own." Then they heard it, rotor blades slicing through the night sky. A helicopter. They ducked behind a wrecked taxi as a military chopper hovered over a nearby rooftop. A group of soldiers was loading supplies while a high-ranking officer barked orders. "That's our way out," Mark whispered. Betrayal in the ranks. Before they could get closer, gunfire erupted from the shadows. A group of rogue survivors ambushed the soldiers, hoping to hijack the chopper. But the military fought back mercilessly. The streets erupted into chaos as bullets tore through flesh, both human and infected. Evelyn and Mark hit the ground, crawling toward cover. "They're killing everyone," Evelyn hissed. "They're not taking survivors." Mark clenched his jaw. The military wasn't just pulling out, they were wiping out anyone who could spread the truth. Then, amid the bloodbath, Mark spotted someone familiar. Quinn. She and her enforcers had followed them. And now, she was watching the battle unfold with cold calculation. She wasn't trying to escape. She was trying to seize power. A desperate gamble. Quinn's people moved in, silently taking down wounded soldiers, stealing their weapons. Evelyn turned to Mark. "We have to act now." Mark's eyes darted between the chaos and the helicopter. If they waited too long, the military would either leave or kill everyone left standing. "We'll never make it through that mess," he said. Evelyn's gaze hardened. "Then we start our own." She grabbed a flare gun from a fallen soldier's belt and fired it into a nearby fuel truck. Boom! The explosion rocked the street, sending flaming debris in all directions. The infected were drawn to the noise instantly, pouring in from every alley. Now, it was anyone's game. The race for the chopper. The battlefield turned into a massacre. The infected ripped through soldiers and survivors alike, and in the confusion, Mark and Evelyn sprinted toward the rooftop. Gunfire erupted as Quinn's group fought to claim the helicopter. Mark fired back, dropping 2 of Quinn's men, while Evelyn dodged flying debris. The helicopter's engines roared to life. The pilot wasn't waiting for anyone. "We have to move," Mark shouted. Evelyn grabbed onto a metal ladder just as the chopper began lifting off. Mark followed, barely catching her hand as they dangled over the city. Below them, Quinn screamed in rage as the infected swarmed her group. Then, in a final act of defiance, she lifted a stolen grenade launcher and fired. The rocket soared straight toward them. Mark's eyes widened. "Hold on!" The world exploded in flames. The explosion rocked the helicopter like a paper plane caught in a storm. The fiery blast consumed part of the tail, sending it into a violent spin. Mark and Evelyn clung to the ladder for dear life as the city below became a dizzying blur of destruction. Inside the cockpit, the pilot struggled with the controls, yelling into his headset. "Mayday! We're going down. I repeat, we're going." The chopper lurched violently. Mark's grip slipped. "Mark!" Evelyn screamed as his fingers lost their hold. Time seemed to slow as he tumbled through the air, the wind roaring in his ears. His heart pounded as he braced for impact, then, with a sickening crash, he smashed through the glass roof of a department store. Darkness swallowed him. Trapped in the abyss. Mark groaned, his entire body screaming in agony. He had landed on a pile of broken mannequins, their lifeless eyes staring at him through the dim emergency lighting. Blood dripped from a gash on his forehead, blurring his vision. Above him, the helicopter spiraled out of control, disappearing into the ruins with a deafening explosion. "Evelyn!" He forced himself to his feet, ignoring the stabbing pain in his ribs. "Evelyn!" he shouted into the darkness. Silence. Then, movement. Not hers. Shadows stirred between the store aisles. The faint flicker of emergency lights illuminated figures staggering toward him, their twisted bodies jerking unnaturally. The infected had found him first. Hunted in the dark. Mark stumbled backward, gripping a metal pipe from the wreckage. He wasn't going down without a fight. The first infected lunged. Mark swung hard, caving in its skull with a sickening crunch. Another one lunged from the side, its rotten hands clawing at him. He shoved a broken mannequin into its path, using the distraction to scramble toward the escalators. He needed to get out. Fast. But as he reached the lower floor, his stomach twisted. The entire store was filled with them. Dozens. Maybe more. Their hollow eyes locked onto him, and as one, they began to move. No escape. Evelyn's fight for survival. Outside, Evelyn groaned as she pulled herself from the wreckage of the helicopter. Flames roared around her, the metal twisted and broken. She had survived the crash. Barely. The pilot hadn't been so lucky. His body was impaled on a jagged piece of rebar, his dead eyes reflecting the burning city. Evelyn clenched her teeth. No time to grieve. She scanned the area. The helicopter had crashed atop a parking garage. Below, the streets teemed with infected, drawn to the explosion. Mark. She had seen him fall. He was somewhere out there. Alone. Evelyn grabbed the pilot's sidearm, checking the magazine, only 6 bullets. Not enough. Then, she heard something else. Footsteps. Not the mindless shuffle of the infected. These were heavier. Purposeful. She ducked behind the wreckage as 2 figures emerged from the shadows, soldiers. Or what was left of them. Their uniforms were torn, their armor splattered with blood. But they weren't just survivors. They had gear, weapons, and radios. And they were looking for something. Or someone. A sinister truth. Evelyn barely breathed as the soldiers scanned the crash site. One of them knelt beside the pilot's corpse, checking for signs of life before shaking his head. The chopper's done, he muttered into his radio. No survivors. Evelyn gripped her gun tighter. If they found her, she doubted they'd help. The other soldier sighed. Doesn't matter. The city's lost. Command's moving to Phase 2. Evelyn's pulse quickened. Phase 2? The first soldier hesitated. You sure about this? I mean, bombing the whole place? What if there are still uninfected people in there? A long silence. Then, the cold reply. Collateral damage. Orders are orders. Evelyn's stomach turned. The military wasn't just abandoning Ravensheim. They were about to wipe it off the map. And she and Mark were still inside. The clock is ticking. Mark fought his way through the department store, battering his way past the infected, gasping for air as he reached an emergency exit. He shoved through the door, only to freeze. Outside, the sky was alive with aircraft. Bombers. And they were getting into position. The city wasn't just dying. It was about to burn. Mark stood frozen, his breath caught in his throat. The sky above Ravensheim was alive with war machines, massive bombers gliding through the night like silent executioners. The final stage of the military's plan was beginning. From his vantage point, he could see the outskirts of the city already consumed in flames. The first wave of airstrikes had begun, targeting key infrastructure, bridges, highways, tunnels, sealing the fate of anyone still trapped inside. His mind screamed one thing. Find Evelyn. Get out. A perilous reunion. Mark sprinted through the ruined streets, dodging the infected that lurched toward him. His body ached from the fall, but adrenaline kept him moving. Gunfire erupted in the distance. Evelyn. He followed the sound, cutting through an alley littered with burning debris. As he reached the edge of a parking garage, he saw her, perched behind the wreckage of the crashed helicopter, a smoking handgun in her grasp. 2 bodies lay at her feet, soldiers. Evelyn looked up, relief flashing in her eyes. Mark. He climbed up as quickly as he could. She was bleeding from a gash on her forehead, her clothes torn, but she was alive. You okay? He panted. No time. We have to move. Now. She gestured toward the sky. The bombers were closing in. The military isn't just pulling out, she said. They're burning this place to the ground. Mark gritted his teeth. I saw them taking out the exits. There's no way out by land. Evelyn took a deep breath. Then we don't use land. Mark blinked. What? One last chance. Evelyn crouched and pulled something from one of the dead soldiers' packs, a radio. I heard them talking. There's a final evac point for high-ranking personnel. The last military transport is leaving the city in less than an hour. Mark's eyes widened. Where? The docks. His stomach dropped. The docks were across the city, beyond swarms of infected, collapsing buildings, and military patrols that were under orders to kill anything that moved. Do we even know if we can make it in time? Mark asked. Evelyn's expression hardened. If we don't, we die here. The road of fire. They descended into the streets, forced to move fast. The bombing had triggered chaos, gas lines exploded, buildings crumbled, and fire consumed everything in sight. The infected were no longer the biggest threat. It was the city itself. As they ran, the ground beneath them trembled. A section of the street caved in as the sewer system collapsed, swallowing cars and bodies alike. Mark grabbed Evelyn's hand, pulling her away just in time. They had no time to rest. The military's final sweep had begun. Drones hovered above, scanning for movement. If they were spotted, they'd be gunned down instantly. Mark and Evelyn ducked into an abandoned subway station, using the tunnels to move unseen. The darkness was suffocating. The air was thick with decay. Then, from the depths of the tunnels, came a sound that sent shivers down their spines. A growl. Not like the usual infected. This was deeper. Hungrier. Then they saw it. A new kind of infected. The final nightmare. It was taller than the others, its body grotesquely twisted, its movements unnatural. Its skin was stretched tight over bulging muscles, and its milky eyes locked onto them with terrifying awareness. It wasn't just a mindless husk. It was a predator. The creature let out a guttural snarl and charged. Mark and Evelyn ran. The tunnels shook as the monstrous infected pursued them, its speed unnatural. It crashed through abandoned train cars, its claws ripping through metal. They burst out onto the surface, the creature right behind them. The docks were visible in the distance. The final transport helicopter was prepping for takeoff. But between them and salvation was an army of the infected. Mark gripped his weapon tighter. Evelyn raised her stolen rifle. They had one fight left. The final stand begins. The docks lay ahead, the last hope of escape. A massive military transport helicopter idled on a loading platform, its rotors slicing through the thick, smoke-filled air. Soldiers scrambled to secure the area, shouting into radios, preparing for departure. But between Mark and Evelyn and that chopper stood an unstoppable nightmare. The monstrous infected, faster, stronger, more intelligent, lurched onto the dock, its grotesque form illuminated by the fires raging behind them. And it wasn't alone. A horde of undead swarmed the waterfront, drawn by the sounds of the evacuation. Hundreds of them, moaning, growling, their decayed hands reaching hungrily for fresh flesh. There was no way around them. They had to go through. No more running. Mark and Evelyn locked eyes. "This is it," Mark said, gripping his rifle. Evelyn nodded. "We either fight our way out, or we die here." Without hesitation, they charged. Bullets tore through the infected as Mark fired in controlled bursts, clearing a path. Evelyn covered his flank, taking down anything that got too close. But the horde was endless. The monstrous infected roared and lunged at them, swiping with unnatural speed. Mark barely dodged its attack, rolling across the ground. Evelyn fired, hitting it square in the chest, but the creature barely flinched. Too strong. It grabbed Mark and threw him like a rag doll. He crashed into a stack of cargo crates, his vision blurring from the impact. Evelyn screamed and emptied her rifle into the creature's head, but it kept coming. Then, from the helicopter, a voice boomed over a megaphone. "Get to the chopper. Now." The side door of the helicopter was open. A soldier inside waved frantically for them to move. But the monster stood between them and escape. The ultimate sacrifice. Mark staggered to his feet, shaking off the pain. He spotted something near the crates, a fuel barrel. A desperate idea formed in his mind. "Evelyn," he shouted, tossing her his last magazine. "Get to the chopper." Her eyes widened. "What?" "No. I'm not leaving you. Just go." Mark grabbed a nearby flare gun and ran straight at the monster. The creature roared and charged toward him. Mark dodged at the last second, leading it right past the fuel barrel. Then, without hesitation, he fired the flare. The barrel erupted in a massive explosion, engulfing the monster in a fiery inferno. The force of the blast knocked Evelyn off her feet. "Mark," she screamed. The final escape. The explosion created a shockwave, sending burning infected flying in all directions. The horde, momentarily disoriented, gave Evelyn just enough time. She scrambled to her feet, sprinting toward the helicopter. The soldier reached out, grabbing her hand, pulling her inside. The pilot shouted, "We can't wait any longer." The chopper began to lift off, just as the docks became overwhelmed with undead. Evelyn pressed against the open doorway, scanning the flames and wreckage below. No sign of Mark. Tears blurred her vision as the city of Ravensheim disappeared beneath them, swallowed by destruction. Then, another explosion. The military's final airstrike. Missiles rained down, leveling the entire dockyard in a fiery apocalypse. The last remnants of the city, its buildings, its infected, and everyone still trapped inside, were wiped from existence. Aftermath. The helicopter soared over the burning wasteland. Inside, survivors sat in stunned silence. Evelyn clutched the rifle in her lap, her hands trembling. She had survived. But Mark was gone. Or was he? As she turned toward the pilot's radio, a thought burned in her mind. If anyone could have escaped that explosion, it was Mark. And if he was still out there, somewhere, she would find him. To be continued.